September 4, 1942. Rabaul, New Britain. The tropical rain came down in soft sheets, blurring the edges of the airfield and turning the volcanic dust into slick, gray mud. Beneath a camouflaged canopy of palm fronds, Lieutenant General Kiyotake Kawaguchi studied the operations map spread across an ammunition crate. His staff officers stood in silence, their uniforms still carrying the red dust of embarkation. On the table, Guadalcanal appeared as a thin green crescent, a minor island, but a strategic wound. It was the first place where the rising sun had been stopped. Kawaguchi's voice was calm, his tone ceremonial. "The American Marines on Longa Point are few," he said. "They are exhausted, isolated, and lacking supply. We will crush them in one night." The statement was recorded in the 35th Brigade's operations log that afternoon, confident, unambiguous. Imperial headquarters had accepted it without hesitation. Japan still believed in the myth of its own unstoppable night attacks. From Shanghai to Malaya, they had advanced through darkness, bayonets fixed, trusting discipline to overcome firepower. Guadalcanal, they believed, would be no different. In the hangars nearby, transports were being loaded, crates of rice, ammunition, and horses for the brigade's small artillery section. The smell of oil and sweat mingled with sea salt and decay. Men of the 124th Infantry Regiment lounged beside their packs, smoking in silence. They had been veterans of Borneo and Singapore, confident, experienced soldiers who had never met an enemy that could stop them once the bugles sounded. Many carried their swords sharpened anew for the coming attack. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." That same day, a captured U.S. reconnaissance report crossed Kawaguchi's desk. It estimated only 2 battalions defending Henderson Field. The document reinforced everything he wanted to believe. He smiled faintly. To him, the campaign was no longer about tactics, it was about restoring faith. Guadalcanal had become a humiliation. Tokyo newspapers spoke of temporary setbacks. The Navy had promised to retake the airfield quickly. Kawaguchi was to provide proof of Japan's moral superiority. He would land at Taiva Point on the island's north coast, march his 6,000 men through the jungle, and strike the airfield from the south. The Americans, he was told, had built a rough runway and little else. It would be a swift blow, one that would erase the shame of the August landings. The war diary of Captain Shoji of the 2nd Battalion noted, "Our general believes the enemy will vanish by morning. We are to move lightly, carrying 2 days of rice and full ammunition." In truth, the plan was already doomed. Intelligence underestimated the terrain, hills thick with kunai grass, rivers swollen from daily rain, leeches clinging to every step. The naval supply ships would unload too far east, forcing Kawaguchi's troops into a 15-mile march through uncharted jungle. But in the fluorescent stillness of Rabaul's headquarters, those details seemed minor. The staff believed in precedent, not topography. Far to the southeast, at that same hour, 840 Marines were digging shallow trenches along a coral ridge near Henderson Field. Their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Merit Red Mike Edson, watched the sky burn red with the setting sun and muttered to his adjutant, "They're coming soon." His men were exhausted from weeks of night alarms and artillery raids. Many had begun to dream standing up, rifles in hand. They didn't know Kawaguchi's name, but they could feel him coming. Back in Rabaul, the rain eased. Kawaguchi rolled his map carefully and turned to his operations chief. "We will show the Emperor," he said softly, "that Japan's spirit cannot be beaten by machines." Around him, the air was heavy with belief, the kind that confuses courage with inevitability. The convoy departed that evening. Engines rumbled, decks creaked under the weight of crates and men. By dawn, the ships were dark specks on the horizon, heading toward a green island that would turn the promise of one night into 3 days of slaughter. September 7, 1942. The dawn broke like a blade through the clouds as the first of Kawaguchi's transports approached Guadalcanal's Taiva Point. The surf glowed pale against black volcanic sand. To the men watching from the decks, the island looked silent, an empty coastline of palm trees and low mist. The landing began without resistance. By mid-morning, over 6,000 men had come ashore, their rifles slung and spirits high. In the captured Japanese war diary of the 4th Air Group, one officer wrote, "The operation proceeds smoothly. The enemy flees before our arrival. Victory will be swift." But the illusion of ease ended as soon as they moved inland. The jungle was no friend to armies. Within hours, the orderly columns dissolved into chaos, men sinking knee-deep in mud, horses stumbling, mules collapsing under the weight of artillery parts. Maps, drawn hastily in Rabaul, bore little resemblance to the terrain. The narrow trails turned to rivers in the afternoon downpour. The humidity suffocated breath and rusted rifle bolts. Mosquitoes swarmed in black clouds, the smell of rot rose from the soil. Kawaguchi's officers tried to maintain formation, shouting orders that vanished beneath the roar of insects. A soldier from the 124th Regiment later recalled, "It was like marching inside a green furnace. The jungle swallowed us. We did not see the sky for days." The men carried only 2 days' worth of rice, a decision born of confidence. But by the second night, rations were nearly gone. Fires could not be lit for fear of discovery, so they chewed raw rice mixed with muddy water and pressed on. The jungle was not the only enemy. The terrain forced Kawaguchi to split his force into 3 separate columns, the main body under his direct command, a right flank led by Colonel Oka, and a left flank under Major General Kakusho. Coordination became impossible. The men navigated by compass and instinct, often veering miles off course. Radio batteries failed in the humidity. The 35th Brigade's promise of one night of battle was already turning into an ordeal. On September 9th, a sudden tropical storm struck. Torrents of rain pounded the columns, collapsing bridges and drowning the horses. Rifles rusted, ammunition turned soggy. Medical records from captured documents show over 300 men fell out of line due to exhaustion or fever before they even reached contact range. The sound of the sea faded behind them, only the cries of unseen animals filled the nights. Meanwhile, at Longa Point, American patrols along the Matanikau River reported strange noises in the jungle, wood chopping, faint bugle calls, and the murmur of thousands of unseen men. Lieutenant Colonel Edson gathered his officers in the flickering light of a Coleman lantern. "They're moving through the trees," he said. "The question is where they'll hit." His men began reinforcing the ridge south of Henderson Field, a narrow, coral-backed rise later known as Bloody Ridge. By September 11th, the first Japanese stragglers began to appear near the Longa perimeter, gaunt and silent. They were scouts from Kawaguchi's vanguard, moving ahead of the main body. That night, an American patrol ambushed them, brief flashes of light, shouts in Japanese, then silence. When dawn came, the jungle floor was littered with spent shell casings and abandoned packs marked with Japanese characters. Kawaguchi's advance continued, but the myth of the one-night victory was dying. In his own operations log, recovered after the war, a note appeared in careful brushstrokes: "The jungle consumes our strength. The men march as ghosts." By September 12, after 5 days of struggle, Kawaguchi's main body finally reached the outskirts of the ridge. The men were starving, soaked, and fevered, yet their spirits remained tied to the promise of Rabaul. That night, under the dripping palms, Kawaguchi gathered his commanders. He pointed toward the dark silhouette of Henderson Field glowing faintly in the distance and said, "Tomorrow night, we redeem the empire." But the jungle had already chosen its side. September 12, 1942. The rain finally stopped. Mist drifted low over the jungle canopy, wrapping the hills around Henderson Field in a cold, silver haze. The ridge, an unremarkable spine of coral and scrub trees, stood as the final rise before the open ground of the airfield. From the north, it offered a commanding view; from the south, it looked deceptively defensible. To Edson's men, it was merely a patch of high ground to rest upon. To Kawaguchi, it was the key to destroying the Americans in a single strike. Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson had been fighting almost without sleep for 2 weeks. A veteran of Tulagi and Gavutu, he understood the jungle's cruelty. His raiders, lean, sunburned men in faded dungarees, were exhausted but alert. They had been pulled off patrol duty only days before, expecting a brief respite. Instead, they were ordered to occupy the ridge line south of the Lunga perimeter. Just for the night, someone said. But as they dug in, Edson could sense something coming. He ordered foxholes deepened in machine guns placed in overlapping fields of fire. The 1st Parachute Battalion joined them on the left flank, men who had once trained for skydrops now turned into infantry by necessity. Between them, fewer than 850 Marines held the entire ridge. Their supplies were minimal, 2 days' worth of rations, limited ammunition, and a single 37mm anti-tank gun hauled into position by hand. Behind them, the faint hum of engines from Henderson Field was the only sign of the war beyond the trees. At 2000 hours, the jungle began to whisper. Scouts reported movement, faint rustling, the glint of bayonets in the moonlight. Flares arced overhead, illuminating glimpses of hundreds of figures moving through the brush. Kawaguchi had massed more than 3,000 men in the darkness, organized into small assault waves. Their orders were simple: attack silently, overwhelm the ridge, and seize the airfield by dawn. The first assault came just before 2100. It began with the cry of a bugle, shrill, echoing through the trees, followed by shouts of banzai. The Japanese surged forward, rifles and bayonets flashing, grenades bursting in the darkness. The Marines opened fire at point-blank range. Machine guns ripped through the night, tracer rounds carving arcs of red light. The ridge came alive with chaos, the smell of cordite, the sound of shouting and splintering wood. Private Harold Taylor of the Raiders later wrote, "You couldn't see them until they were right on you. They came in waves, we'd cut them down, and another line would rise behind them." The Japanese charged uphill, tripping over roots and corpses, pressing forward with bayonets and grenades. When ammunition ran low, Marines threw rocks and knives. In one sector, a flamethrower jammed, forcing its operator to fight with his pistol until reinforcements arrived. By midnight, the ridge was a killing ground. Kawaguchi's men had breached the center twice, each time repelled by counterattacks led personally by Edson. He moved from foxhole to foxhole, shouting encouragement, calm even under fire. His voice carried through the gun smoke, "Hold the line. No one falls back without orders." Rain began again around 0200, turning the coral slope into slick mud. The dead slid downhill, wounded men crawled through puddles for cover. The Japanese regrouped for a second assault, this time with coordinated flanking attacks from both sides. Flares turned the sky white. For 30 minutes, the ridge disappeared in light and thunder. But the Marines held, their fire disciplined, their nerves steady. When dawn came, the jungle floor below the ridge was carpeted with bodies. The air smelled of wet powder and blood. Edson's men counted over 200 enemy dead within sight, and hundreds more lay deeper in the undergrowth. The ridge was still theirs, but barely. As the sun rose, Edson climbed to the crest and looked toward the distant sea. Smoke rose from the jungle, curling through the mist. His face was pale and hollow-eyed. "They'll be back tonight," he muttered. And he was right, the hardest night was still to come. September 13, 1942. The day passed in uneasy silence. After the night's slaughter, the jungle seemed to hold its breath. Smoke hung low over the ridge, drifting between the twisted trees. Marines moved like shadows, dragging ammunition boxes, reinforcing foxholes, and carrying the wounded to makeshift aid posts along the reverse slope. The air stank of gunpowder, blood, and rot. Edson's raiders had been reduced to fragments. Companies that had gone into battle 100 strong now numbered barely 40. The 1st Parachute Battalion had taken even worse losses. Many of the men hadn't eaten in 2 days. They were soaked to the bone, faces streaked with mud and exhaustion. Yet none spoke of retreat. Henderson Field lay less than a mile behind them, and every man knew what was at stake. At noon, a patrol from the right flank brought word the Japanese were regrouping in the jungle south of the ridge. The sound of chopping echoed faintly through the trees as they cleared new assault lanes. Scouts reported entire companies moving silently, carrying bamboo ladders and mortars. The enemy was preparing for another attack, larger and more deliberate. Kawaguchi's plan had not changed. His pride, and his orders, demanded success. He had promised Rabaul that the American infestation would be erased in a single night. Now, with over 1,000 men already dead or missing, he sought redemption through annihilation. At 1,600 hours, he addressed his surviving officers beneath a rain tarp. "Tonight, we fulfill the Emperor's will," he declared. "No retreat. No dawn without victory." That evening, as darkness fell once more, Edson gathered his own officers at the base of the ridge. His voice was hoarse but steady. "They'll hit us again, hard. There's no one behind us but airfield crews and wounded. We hold here, or Henderson's lost." He pointed toward the low coral crest where the raiders had dug in again, the ground already churned with shell casings and rainwater. "This ridge," he said quietly, "is the hinge of the whole damn war." By 2100, the jungle erupted. Mortar shells began to fall, their explosions muffled by the trees. Then came the bugles, shrill, mocking, followed by the deep roar of voices shouting "Banzai." The second assault had begun. This time, the Japanese came in coordinated waves from 3 directions, hundreds at a time. The left flank crumpled under the first impact, forcing Edson to throw in his last reserve, a platoon of engineers armed with rifles and satchel charges. They fought hand-to-hand along the ridge crest, the air thick with smoke and screams. Machine gun crews fired until their barrels glowed red. The 37mm gun spat canister rounds that shredded entire squads at once. Private First Class Joe Rumberger, manning a .30 caliber gun, recalled later, "You'd fire until they were right in front of you, and then you'd swing the barrel into them. There was no line anymore. Just chaos." By midnight, the Japanese had broken through the center again. Edson personally led a counterattack with 20 raiders, bayonets fixed, grenades primed. They drove the enemy back down the slope, step by bloody step. The ridge was slick with mud and bodies. The smell of death clung to the air. At 0300, a final, desperate wave surged up the southern face. It was led by Major General Kawaguchi himself, sword in hand. Flares from Henderson Field lit the scene in ghostly white. For a few minutes, it seemed the line would collapse. Marines fought with knives, shovels, even fists. Then the sky thundered, the drone of engines overhead. Cactus Air Force pilots, guided by radio from the ridge, strafed the jungle with machine gun fire and dropped flares to expose the attackers. The momentum broke. By dawn, the ridge was silent again, a graveyard of ambition. When the sun rose on September 14, Edson stood on the crest, his uniform blackened with soot. Around him lay over 600 Japanese dead. Behind him, 840 Marines, what remained of his force, had held. Henderson Field still stood. And the myth of Japanese invincibility had died on that ridge. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. September 14, 1942. Dawn broke red over Guadalcanal. Smoke from the burned ridge drifted low across the jungle, curling around the palm trees like ghosts reluctant to leave. The battle was over, but its echoes still rolled through the canopy, the groans of the wounded, the crack of sporadic rifle fire, the whine of insects drawn to blood. For 3 days and 2 nights, 840 Marines had held against 6,000. Now, what remained of both armies lay scattered over a mile of ruined jungle. At first light, Edson moved among his men. His face was streaked with grime, eyes hollow from sleeplessness. He carried no weapon, only a canteen, which he passed from man to man. Some Marines wept openly as they looked around the ridge. Others just stared, too numb for words. The dead were everywhere, tangled in roots, sprawled across the coral, half covered by mist. "We'll bury them all," Edson said quietly. "Ours and theirs." By mid-morning, corpsmen began tending to the wounded, many of them Japanese soldiers left behind by the retreat. Some had crawled for hours, clutching empty canteens or bloodied flags. The raiders gave them water, even as they guarded them with rifles ready. One prisoner, an officer from Kawaguchi's staff, muttered through cracked lips, "We were told the Marines were few. We thought you would run." Behind the ridge, the men of the CB's and airfield crews came forward to help. They carried stretchers, dug graves, and cleared debris. Henderson Field, the strip of coral that the Japanese had sworn to destroy, still hummed with life. Mechanics worked feverishly, repairing bullet-riddled aircraft while pilots prepared for the inevitable retaliation. Every man knew the battle for Guadalcanal was far from over. At noon, an inspection party from the 1st Marine Division arrived. General Alexander Vandegrift himself climbed the ridge, stepping carefully among the corpses. When he reached the crest, he saluted Edson. "You did more than hold," he said quietly. "You turned the tide." That afternoon, the ridge was officially renamed Edson's Ridge, though to the men who fought there, it would always be Bloody Ridge. Far to the south, Kawaguchi's shattered remnants limped back toward the coast. Their once proud 35th Brigade was now a ghost battalion, hungry, barefoot, many delirious with fever. Of the 6,000 who had landed at Taiva Point, less than half made it out alive. Kawaguchi himself, wounded and broken, was evacuated by canoe through the surf. His final report to Rabaul read, "Enemy resistance far stronger than anticipated. Our loss is severe. The operation has failed." In Tokyo, the official communiqué softened the blow. Newspapers spoke of a temporary withdrawal and heavy losses inflicted upon the enemy. But within the Imperial General Headquarters, the truth was known: the myth of Japanese invincibility had cracked. Guadalcanal was no longer a campaign, it was a war of attrition, one Japan could not afford. For the Americans, the victory came at a cost too heavy to celebrate. Of the 840 men who had defended the ridge, nearly 250 were dead or wounded. Supplies were running low, malaria spread faster than reinforcements could arrive. Yet for the first time since the Pacific War began, the U.S. Marines had stopped a major Japanese offensive cold. That night, the raiders gathered near the edge of the ridge. Someone found a harmonica and began to play softly, the sound drifting out toward the jungle. Around the flickering glow of a single lantern, the men sat silent, too tired to talk, too proud to sleep. Beyond them, Henderson's airstrip glowed faintly under the moon, the sound of aircraft engines rising into the humid night. In his journal, Edson wrote one line before closing it forever. "We held because there was nowhere else to go." 3 days earlier, Kawaguchi had promised to crush the Marines in a single night. Now, his army was gone, the ridge still stood, and the course of the Pacific War had begun to turn. In the days following the battle, Guadalcanal seemed to exhale. The jungle, once deafened by gunfire, settled into an uneasy quiet broken only by rain and the hum of flies. But beneath that silence lay the scars of a turning point. The ridge, the airfield, even the streams below were thick with the signs of what had happened. For 3 days, 840 Americans had faced 6,000 Japanese soldiers. Now, the earth itself bore the memory, trenches filled with water, shell holes brimming with smoke, and the smell of iron and decay. On September 15th, burial parties began their grim work. Marines moved methodically through the mud, marking graves with helmeted rifles. Japanese and American dead alike were collected, their identities noted where possible. Chaplains read prayers over the mounds, their voices steady though their hands trembled. One chaplain later wrote, "We buried them shoulder to shoulder, men who hours before had tried to kill each other." The jungle made no distinction between flags. At Henderson Field, the tempo of war resumed almost immediately. Aircrews repaired wrecked Wildcats and dauntless dive bombers, patching holes with sheet metal scavenged from destroyed aircraft. Each morning, the Cactus Air Force lifted off to strike enemy barges and destroy Japanese supply lines along the northern coast. Every gallon of fuel, every bullet fired, was wrestled from scarcity. Guadalcanal remained an island barely held, but held nonetheless. For the survivors of Edson's raiders, rest came in fragments. Their bodies bore the toll of exhaustion and disease, fevered from malaria, their feet blistered and bleeding. Some could not speak of what they had seen, Others spoke only in short, quiet sentences, as if afraid the jungle still listened. When replacements arrived, they were stunned by what they found: men thinner, older, and harder than their years. Back at the division headquarters, General Vandegrift sent a coded report to Washington: Japanese attack repelled with heavy enemy losses. Our position secure. In the simplicity of those words, the ferocity of the fight was buried, a fact known only to the men who had stood on that ridge. Yet the message carried across the Pacific, lighting a spark of hope in a war that had until then seemed all defeat. In Rabaul, the reaction was rage. Kawaguchi was relieved of command within a week. His surviving officers faced stern reprimands, accused of cowardice and poor coordination. Japanese records later captured by Allied forces revealed the bitterness of those days. One entry read, "We underestimated the enemy. Their firepower and resolve are beyond expectation. Our men died bravely, but the jungle itself fought against us." The Imperial Japanese Navy, recognizing the failure, began to divert more ships and aircraft to Guadalcanal, the start of a campaign that would bleed them dry. For every ton of supplies the Americans landed, the Japanese had to fight 10 times harder to deliver theirs. The ridge had not just been a battlefield, it had become a symbol of endurance. By October, word of the stand reached the United States. Newspapers printed headlines like "Marines hold Guadalcanal" and "Yanks stop 6,000 in jungle inferno." At the National Press Building in Washington, reporters read the accounts in disbelief. The story of a few hundred men holding off an entire brigade became legend, retold in factories, schools, and barracks. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Americans began to believe they could win. In the months that followed, Henderson Field would endure bombing raids, starvation, and more assaults. But the tide had shifted. The Japanese no longer attacked with confidence, they attacked with desperation. The jungle had consumed Kawaguchi's army, and in doing so, it had broken the myth that Japan could not be stopped. Years later, veterans of the battle would gather again on that same ridge, now peaceful and overgrown. They would stand among the rusting shells and broken rifles and remember the night the world began to change, the night when, under the shadow of Henderson Field, they refused to fall. By October 1942, the battle for Guadalcanal had entered its second act. The front lines shifted daily: streams, coconut groves, and ridges traded hands in savage, confused skirmishes. Yet amid the constant fighting, one piece of ground remained untouched: the coral ridge south of Henderson Field. To new arrivals, it looked unremarkable, a low rise covered in kunai grass and shattered palms. But for those who had been there in September, the place carried a gravity that could not be measured in maps or orders. Edson's raiders had been withdrawn to the rear for rest, though few could truly rest. The bodies healed, but the minds stayed behind on the ridge. Men flinched at sudden sounds. Some woke screaming in their foxholes at night. They called it the ridge ghost, the echo of bugles and shouting that seemed to drift through the trees long after the battle ended. "You'd hear them at dusk," one Marine recalled. "That bugle, that same damned note, just faint. Like they were still out there, coming again." The Japanese, too, could not escape its shadow. Prisoner interrogations in late October revealed the depth of the psychological wound. One captured sergeant from the 124th Regiment told his interrogators, "We were told the Marines were beasts, not men. But on the ridge, they did not break. The jungle itself protected them." Another officer admitted that morale among his surviving troops had collapsed. After Kawaguchi's defeat, he said, "No one believed we could win easily again." For the Americans, Bloody Ridge became more than a battlefield, it was a lesson. The defense of Henderson Field had proven that the Japanese, though fierce and disciplined, could be stopped through endurance and firepower. Training manuals circulated among Marine units now cited the ridge as a case study in small unit defense, coordination, and leadership under pressure. General Vandegrift's staff even published diagrams showing how Edson had organized overlapping fields of fire, a blueprint for future island defenses. Supplies began to flow more regularly as the U.S. Navy slowly regained control of the surrounding seas. C-47 transport planes landed daily, bringing food, ammunition, and mail. For the first time, the men on Guadalcanal felt the faint comfort of connection with the outside world. Still, life was brutal. Malaria cases outnumbered combat wounds. Every day, the stench of the jungle mixed with the drone of flies over hastily buried graves. Yet among all this hardship, a quiet pride grew. The ridge had become part of Marine Corps identity, proof that the Corps could meet and hold against the best the enemy had to offer. When replacements arrived, veterans pointed toward the coral rise and told them, "That's where we stopped them." The younger men listened in silence, knowing that whatever happened next, they were standing on sacred ground. In the months that followed, new battles erupted: the Matanacaw, the Ila River, and the sea battles of the Tokyo Express. Each was brutal, each claimed its toll. But none carried the raw desperation of those September nights. Henderson Field remained in operation, its runways buzzing with aircraft that now hunted Japanese convoys by day and night. The Cactus Air Force had turned the island from a target into a fortress. By year's end, Japanese command began quietly preparing for evacuation. Guadalcanal had become a graveyard for ambition, a campaign that consumed ships, soldiers, and hope. In Tokyo, Prime Minister Tojo himself lamented in a cabinet meeting, "The island is a bleeding wound." On the ridge, grass had begun to grow again among the coral pits and rusting shell casings. The rain washed away the blood but not the memory. Those who walked there could still feel the weight of the fight, the soundless testimony of men who refused to yield. Long after the last shot was fired, the ridge endured as more than a landmark. It became a symbol of resistance, of endurance, and of the moment when the Pacific War turned from fear to resolve. February 1943. The last Japanese transport slipped beneath the surf off Cape Esperance, engines throttled low, lights blacked out. After 6 months of unrelenting battle, the evacuation of Guadalcanal was complete. The Imperial Japanese Army had abandoned the island it once swore to claim, leaving behind 30,000 graves and a shattered dream of dominance in the South Pacific. For the Marines and soldiers who remained, the silence that followed was almost unbearable. Bloody Ridge, now overgrown with vines and tall grass, stood untouched, a monument of coral and memory. Rain had softened the trenches, and the jungle had begun reclaiming what war had scarred. But the men still visited it. They walked its slopes slowly, stopping where friends had fallen, running calloused hands over rusting helmets half buried in mud. No monument had yet been raised, no brass plaque installed. Only the silence honored them, and for many, that was enough. Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson was one of the last to leave the island. Before his departure, he returned to the ridge one final time. The sun hung low, lighting the grass with a dull gold sheen. He stood where his command post had once been, a shallow scrape between two palms, and looked toward the airfield, now alive with American planes taking off in endless formation. He thought of the men who had stood with him there, their faces flickering in memory: Taylor, Rumberger, the parachute battalion boys, the ones who never left the slope. "We did it," he murmured, though no one was there to hear. The victory at Guadalcanal did not bring relief, it brought realization. For the first time, both sides understood what kind of war they were truly fighting. It was not a sprint of conquest, but a grinding contest of endurance. Japan had spent her best troops, her finest ships, and the confidence of her people. America had spent blood, and learned that it could be shed and not be wasted. In Washington, the official communiques described the campaign in measured words: enemy evacuated Guadalcanal. Island secured by U.S. forces. But behind those lines, officers in the War Department knew the truth: the battle had marked the first irreversible shift of the Pacific War. Every island that would follow, Tarawa, Saipan, Polilliu, Iwo Jima, would trace its tactical and spiritual lineage to that ridge on Guadalcanal where a few hundred men had stood their ground. For the survivors, homecoming was quiet. Many of Edson's raiders were reassigned, their unit later dissolved. Some went on to fight in New Georgia and Bougainville, carrying with them the unspoken weight of those 3 nights. They rarely spoke of what happened, not out of pride, but because words never seemed to match the memory. When they gathered years later, at reunions or in veterans' halls, their talk would always circle back to the same place. The ridge, someone would say softly, and the others would nod, as if that single word held all the meaning in the world. In Japan, the name Guadalcanal became a whispered symbol of futility. Kawaguchi, disgraced but alive, spent the rest of the war in minor posts. In his post-war testimony to Allied interrogators, he described the battle simply: "We thought the Americans were cornered animals. Instead, they were tigers." His words would later be quoted in the 1962 U.S. Japanese Aviation History Symposium, a rare admission of defeat and respect. By the 1980s, when the veterans of both sides met at a reconciliation ceremony on Guadalcanal, the ridge was quiet again. Rain fell softly on the grass, the jungle thick and green. Old men stood side by side, some in Marine caps, others in the uniforms of the old Imperial Army. They bowed, laid wreaths, and said nothing. The air carried only the sound of the wind moving through palm leaves, a sound older than war, older than hatred. One of Edson's surviving raiders left a small note at the base of a memorial cross. It read, "We were young. We were scared. We did not run." 840 men had stood against 6,000, and in doing so, had changed the course of the Pacific. The ridge still stood, silent and eternal, bearing the weight of victory and the memory of those who had given it shape.